The story begins with Kyuf finding his father's unresponsive body in the living room. The narrator tells us that Kyuf's father hadn't been much of a talker throughout his life, but on that particular day, he had been quieter than usual. Discovering his father's body, Kyuf decides to fulfill his last wish, which is for his body to be dropped in the river near the house, rather than traditional burning. Kyuf drags his body and carefully lets him sink into the water. As his father disappears, he lights up a cigarette and spreads the tobacco around him as his last goodbye. Soaked in the river water, he walks home to sit on the front porch. However, his mother asks where his father is, so he shows her the letter he had written for them. The mother is clearly upset, but Kyuf explains that his father asked to be honored that way. The whole family needs to be informed, so she tells Kyuf to get his cousin while she tries to contact her daughter. Luckily, Mary answers, but as she finds out the news, her heart sinks into her stomach. Kyuf picks up the cousin and they sit in the living room, trying to come up with a plan. Given that his body must have become a mess down in the water, there's no way anyone's going to take him out. Coming up with a solution, Kyuf suggests they lower an empty casket down and tell the people that he requested a closed casket. Although Cora thinks that it's a stupid idea, they settle on it. Kyuf spends the night feeling lonelier than ever, and although he hopes the feeling goes away in the morning, he wakes up feeling worse. The following morning, Sunny, a friend of Frankie's, visits their house. He gives his condolences and shares a warm hug with Cora, pleasantly surprising her. She invites him inside, and he gets emotional, suggesting that a coffin he fixed up for himself could be used for Frankie. It takes Cora by surprise, but given that they don't have a coffin and his wish, she agrees, unaware that Kyuf's been listening all the time. He doesn't seem to like Sunny. Sunny sheds a tear as she accepts his request, feeling honored that Frankie's going to be buried in something he made. He makes sure to express his gratitude. Kyuf wastes no time and gets to digging his father's grave when he gets a call from his cousin. Jim asks him to find some weights so they can make the coffin look realistic. While Kyuf handles the weights, Jim goes to get the coffin. He does run into some legal trouble for not doing it the traditional way, but once he mentions their Seminole culture, the guy doesn't want to bother with them. After filling the coffin with some weights, they sit on the front porch and smoke. Jim mentions how Sunny is a funny guy, but Kyuf doesn't respond. His cousin remembers Frankie as a good man. He tells the story of how he was afraid of a tornado as a youngster. One day, Frankie noticed his fear of the expected tornado, so he made up a dance to keep it away. Years later, Jim found out that the tornado was said not to come on the news. The cousins share a laugh, remembering how good of a father and Uncle Frankie had been. Something seems to be on Kyuf's mind, so he asks Jim whether he even thinks of getting out of their town. Of course, Jim says yes, but he admits that he wouldn't fit anywhere, as home is where their culture is. Frankie's funeral is held the following morning. As friends and family arrive, Kyuf and Cora get ready to meet them. Mary is nowhere to be seen, and they're not surprised, but only if they knew that she was stuck on the road, as her car broke down. Jim arrives shortly, and Kyuf makes sure to thank him for the help. Finally, the funeral begins, and halfway through it, as they're singing their traditional songs, Mary arrives. She hugs her mother and holds her brother as their final moment with their father passes. After the funeral, Mary and Cora sit in the kitchen having a coffee. Looking outside the window, Mary notices that Kyuf is sitting by himself, so she asks Cora whether he ever plans to get out of their town. Cora doesn't know, but suggests she invites him to move in with her. Sipping the coffee, Mira comments on how good it is, and Cora says that her father always made it best. Although they're having a heartfelt moment, Mary notices that something's wrong. She asks Cora, and she tries to blame it on her husband's passing. But Mary knows that something else is up. Cora begs her not to talk about Frankie because it's depressing, but Mary continues up until they start cursing at each other. She takes a walk with Kyuf when she notices that he's acting weird as well. So she asks him whether her dad committed, and Kyuf can't help but tell the truth. He reveals that he had been sick for a while, which is why he ended by taking a bunch of pills. Mary wonders why he did that to their mother, why he left her alone. Kyuf lets her know that Cora misses her, and that she should come back home. Smiling, she assures him that she's not missing her, but rather wants him to feel sorry for her. Mary plans to go back, but before she does, she asks him whether he wants to join her for a drink at the bar. He declines, so she decides to head back as Cora calls out for him. In the evening, to lighten up, Kyuf decides to visit the bar. After some heavy drinking, he cuddles up with a woman at the bar. As he touches her inappropriately, her husband sees and throws a punch at Kyuf. Almost as planned, Kyuf gets called to the local psychiatrist the following day to discuss how he's dealing with the loss of his father. However, the psychiatrist seems to be more interested in his tribe than the problems he's facing. He even brags about dating a girl from their tribe. At the end of the session, he mentions something about it being the hardest loss in life, before sending Kyuf on his way. Kyuf spends his evening reading a book and trying not to think about Frankie, while we see Cora at dinner with Sunny. They seem oddly close, but as she comes back home, she assures Kyuf that they're just friends. He can't help but protest it, and even blame her for the loss of Frankie, so Cora asks him not to blame her, as it had been his choice, not theirs. She reveals that before his demise, Frankie wouldn't even speak to her for weeks. Of course she misses him, but the reality is that he's gone. Reminiscing about the first time they met, she tells him the story and how hard it had been to get his attention. Given that he hadn't noticed her the whole night, she gathered the courage to walk up to him and ask for his name. "Four sheets to the wind" were his first words to her, which still make her smile to this day. Changing the subject, she asks about his meeting with the psychiatrist, and he lets her know that he gave him some pills so he can sleep well. Silence fills the room, so Kyuf tells his mother that he plans on visiting Mary in the city. Cora advises him to take a suit, as he never knows when he'll need one. Before she wishes him goodnight, she asks him not to do her dirty like Mary did, to let her know what he's doing, as it's the only thing keeping an old person alive. Kyuf goes on his adventure the following morning. He walks down the road to the town, then catches the bus, and his journey begins. After falling asleep a couple of times and throwing up halfway, Kyuf finally arrives in the city. He tries to get used to the big buildings as he walks to the building where Mary resides. Arriving at the door, he starts knocking, but no one answers. From the stairs, a beautiful girl walks behind him and giggles to herself. Assuming that he's looking for Mary, she tells him that he's knocking at her door, and that Mary's door is across from hers. Shyly, Kyuf apologizes, and the girl introduces herself as Francie. He continues knocking on Mary's door, hoping that she'll answer when the girl leaves her apartment. Some time passes and Mary's nowhere in sight, so Kyuf decides to walk around the city and explore. He ends up at a bar, and luckily Francie happens to be there at the same time. She notices him, so she decides to approach him by asking for a lighter. She's clearly interested, and he doesn't seem to know how to hold a conversation. Offering to buy some shots, she tries to loosen him up, but he keeps giving her dry answers. She feels like she's forcing him to hang out with her, so she tells him that she'll leave him alone. Feeling bad, he stops her from leaving, and admits to not feeling comfortable because he got punched at a bar, so she offers for them to sit in the booth. Feeling way more comfortable, Kyuf starts talking, telling her about his wishes to visit California. He mentions that Mary has already been there, but she fell for someone, and her dream of becoming an actress in Hollywood turned into dust. He feels as if he's going on about nonsense, so he stops himself before apologizing. Instead of saying anything, she downs her drink and suggests they walk each other home. Getting to their floor, Kyuf checks and sees that Mary has returned. But before he gets a chance to enter the apartment, Francie hugs him. She asks to see him again, and he tells her that he's going to be in the city for a week. They wish each other goodnight and enter the apartments. Walking in, Kyuf sees Mary hungover and throwing up, so he helps her get to the bathroom. After throwing up some more, she jumps into the shower and lets cold water run through her. Mary ends up falling asleep on Kyuf, and as we see Kyuf waking up, the narrator chimes in and reveals that Mary promised herself to never ask for help, after not getting help from her parents in her childhood. Kyuf manages to get some sleep in bed, but Mary decides to wake him up by poking him in the head. He finally wakes up, so Mary tells him where she'd been the previous night. She also asks where he'd been, and Kyuf tells her about Francie. She is shocked to hear that he went out with a girl, let alone with her neighbor, so much so that she doesn't stop talking about it, even when they go to get breakfast. Excited to see where their relationship goes, she suggests he invites her to hang out, since she's going to work, but he opts to watch TV the whole afternoon. As Mary's working her shift, while giving the customer their change, she steals a couple of bills and stuffs them in her pocket. In the evening, the brother-sister duo head to a bar to meet Mary's partner. The moment Kyuf meets him, he doesn't seem to like him. Not only does the guy make fun of his name, he acts like a brat. Regardless, Kyuf keeps it to himself and doesn't say anything. They go back to her apartment, but Kyuf struggles to fall asleep as Mary and her boyfriend engage in intercourse. The following morning, Mary wakes up with regret, which is why she leaves for work early, leaving the man in her bed. Kyuf hears the car start, so he gets up to check who it is. Going into the kitchen, Kyuf tries to make coffee for himself, but sees a note on the coffee machine. Mary has written to him that they are out of coffee, but most importantly, Francie invited him to a party in the evening, and she told her that he was going. Before the party, we see Mary getting Kyuf ready. While he seems insecure about wearing a suit to a party, Mary assures him that he looks great. They finally make it to the party and walk through a sea of people. While waiting in line to get a beer, a guy wearing a similar suit to Kyuf compliments Kyuf's suit. So seeing that they almost have the same thing on, Kyuf compliments him as well. However, that isn't the only odd guy he meets at the party, as one guy repeatedly asks him where all the Indians have gone. Kyuf ends up joining Francie, and they make conversation throughout the night. They finally head home, and as they're walking, she mentions how cool his name is. Then they start joking about her, and she reminds him how he got it wrong when they met for the second time in the bar. Ending up at her apartment, he can't help but admire the pictures on her wall. He asks about them, and she tells him where they've been taken. Seeing the empty frames on the table, he asks about them, and she admits to not having pictures to fill them. However, she gets her camera and snaps a photo of Kyuf. He jokes about it being his bad side, so she takes another one. After smoking, they end up lying next to each other on the bed. She asks about his father and how he's handling it, and he reveals that he's fine. Wanting to talk about good things, she asks about Frankie and what kind of a man he'd been. Tears fill Q's eyes as he talks about his father. He reveals that he used to be a funny man at times, not saying much, but letting the silence speak for itself. The biggest memory he has of him is the frequent fishing. And although he may have said mostly 4 words during those times, it had been meaningful to Q. Finally, he breaks down, wishing that he hadn't ended, wishing to see him again, and wishing to fish with him again. Francie notices the anger and sadness in his eyes, so she moves closer until she's facing him and leans in for a kiss. After sharing a kiss, they hug each other tightly, almost healing all of their pain. In the morning, Q wakes up before her, so he decides to let her sleep. Tiptoeing out of the apartment, he steps into Miri's apartment, only to see her giving him a smirk. He sits next to her, and she lets him know that their mother called the previous night. But before they can discuss it, Miri's boyfriend David calls out for someone to give him a glass of water. Q drops Miri off at work, and she asks him not to damage her car. At work, Miri's boss asks to speak with her, since they're $40 short. After finishing a cup of coffee at the cafe, Q meets up with Francie and they go for a walk. They end up coming back to her apartment again and preparing lunch, already looking like a real couple. With their bellies full, they sit on the couch, wishing and promising each other to meet again once he comes back. While Q seems to be forming a real connection with Francie, a vividly upset Miri tries to find a solution to her problems through a random guy. At the bar, a guy asks to buy Miri a drink, and she accepts, despite being upset. She ends up taking him back to the apartment and having intercourse with him, exactly what her brother tells Francie about her bad taste in men. The last thing Francie asks Q before he returns home is whether he'd like to go on a trip with her, in California. Q promises to make some money and save up, so they can make their wish come true. In the morning, he sees Miri sleeping next to the random guy, so he doesn't bother waking her up. He leaves quietly, and after the long bus ride, he's finally home. As for Miri, a look of regret and sadness can be seen on her face as the guy leaves her apartment. Not much time passes before Cora puts Q to work, so we see him working around the house. Cora sits in the kitchen reading the newspaper as the phone rings. Picking it up, she hears Sunny on the other side, and is pleasantly surprised. He invites her to a date, and she suggests they go to the new Mexican restaurant in the evening. Hanging up the phone, she is joined by her tired son. Curious, she asks whether he misses the city, and he reminds her that it's only been a day. She teases him about being in love, but he assures her that he's not. However, he reveals that he wants to travel with Francie. He plans to roam a couple of houses to make some money for the trip. Cora isn't sure about his traveling ideas, so he promises that he's not leaving, but just wants to get away from their town for a while. Seeing how devoted he is, she asks what Francie's like, and whether they talk. He reveals that they hold a good conversation, so she warns him not to become a sex thing. A couple of days later, he contacts Miri to apologize for leaving without saying goodbye. The call goes to voicemail, so he says everything he had planned to do. Surprisingly, Miri is listening all the time, and as she hears her brother's voice, she starts sobbing to herself quietly. Later in the day, Q meets up with his cousin Jim, and they catch up on what's been going on. Jim asks about Francie, and Q admits that he likes hanging around with her, for which Jim assumes that they're taking things seriously. Q's finally starting to build something for himself, but the same can't be said for his sister. We see her curled up in her bed, sobbing to herself, with an empty bottle of pills beside her. As Francie arrives at her door, she sees the notice of eviction on Miri's door, so she tries to talk to her. However, walking into the apartment, she sees an overdosed Miri, but luckily she's taken to the emergency room immediately. Cora gets the call, and they head straight to the hospital to see her. Luckily, Q has Francie by his side, who makes sure he keeps his spirits up. After getting released from the hospital, they move Miri out of her apartment and take her back home. Q sits on the front porch, smoking a cigarette, when Miri decides to join him. Sitting down, she is vividly embarrassed for what she's done, but she chooses not to say anything. He offers her a cigarette, but she declines. Straightening up, he asks why, and trying her best not to tear up, she admits not meaning to do so. Laying her head on his shoulder, she seeks some kind of confirmation that he's not mad. So once he hugs her back, she breaks down, regretting her choices. Cora decides to reward her son for his hard work and loyalty to her. Putting some cash into a letter, she writes his name on it and leaves it on his bed. Coming into his room, Q sees the envelope, and once she opens it, he starts envisioning his biggest dreams. As Q falls into deep sleep, the narrator chimes in, letting us know that he fell asleep with visions of love and travel. In the morning, he wakes up super early, something he doesn't usually do, but everything is different in that house that morning. Putting on his coat and cap, he starts the truck, waking up his mother. Jumping from her bed, she looks through the window, only to see Q driving away. She goes to Mary's room, only to see her sleeping comfortably. Climbing into bed, she lays behind her daughter when she turns around and snuggles into her chest. Cora feels as if her heart's about to burst with joy when she realizes that her baby girl is back. As Q's driving down the long road to Francie, his path gets blocked by a herd. Looking around, he notices that he stopped next to the river where he submerged his father. He gets out of the car and passes through the trees until he's at the river. Kneeling down, he stares into the water as tears form in his eyes. At a glance, he notices a fishing hook and believes that his father is always with him. At the end of the story, we find out that the narrator was his father. While many people have said that he didn't talk much throughout his life, he lets us know that he preferred listening to them rather than talking with them.